Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is Janaína Pantoja, Director of Education at UXPA International. I'm excited to be here today with Mike Donahue from Citrix, who will be talking about content strategy. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the GoToWebinar control panel, enter your questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. We are also recording the webinar, and we'll share the link with you in about a week or so. A couple of things about UXPA. This is an international organization, and we have a few goals for 2017. Some of them include bringing more UX resources to UX professionals, such as this webinar, and short courses. The short courses consist of 1.5 hour long sessions, 4 of them, and the first one will be on user-centered design for innovation, and it starts in a couple of weeks. We have resources in different languages, and I would encourage you to check our website to explore these resources. And okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Mike Donahue, who will be talking about UX-led content strategy. He's a senior UX architect at Citrix in South Florida, where he lives with his wife and their dogs. When not working, Mike is reading books on psychology and behavior, or talking someone's ear off about the value of designing for emotions. When he needs a break from all that, he grabs his camera and gets out in the nature to get his zen on, taking photos. Nature and wildlife photograph is Mike's artistic outlet and mental salvation. We are very excited to have you here today. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Yana. I appreciate that. So as Yana mentioned, today I want to talk to you about why I believe so passionately that UX really needs to take a lead role in content strategy. Not just sit back and wait for content to come to us, but really take an active participatory role in making it happen, shaping the content that we have and working from the content out. Primarily here at Citrix, I work on our corporate intranet as well as our external facing main corporate website, citrix.com. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be focused on web, but what I hope everybody will take away by the end of this is that with a broader understanding of how we define content and how we think about it, that this really extends beyond just web UX. So let's get started by backing up and trying to change our understanding of what content is. And there's a few little things out there that I think trip a lot of us up and why we get often have a very narrow view of what content can be or what it is. And first off is content is not just text. Content is everything. Now, some of you may be saying, oh, of course, you got videos, you got audio, you got infographics and things like that. And that's true. It's still a somewhat limited view of what content is. But the very first one, and this one's an easy one to get wrong if you work in the web, because depending on who you study and whatnot, they'll tell you that your average web page is anywhere from 80 to 95% content. So if we're not actually dealing with the content, we're overlooking a whole lot of opportunity to shape and craft the experience. The second thing that I think is important to change the way we think about content, we need to stop thinking of it as it's that stuff that we get to replace the lorem ipsum that we put in our mock-ups. We get asked to design a web page or design something before we actually get the content. Inevitably, we end up, by the time we get to the end of the project, it looks nothing like where we started because the content comes in and everything gets blown up. And content has such an important role on the design that we really need to start finding more ways to work from the content out. But another big thing that I'm personally guilty of doing this for years. I ran around with this one saying, and I've come to realize it was a really bad saying, and that was I would tell everybody that content is king, and this is why we needed to work from the content out. But I've come to the realization that content is not king. And I'm sorry if I've spoiled season 3 ending of Game of Thrones for anybody, but if you're that far behind, that one's on you. Uh, Content, we need to change and get away from this idea. And the reason I've come to this conclusion and why I've stopped referring to it this way is because just the saying alone creates a division in people's minds. It's a divisive way of thinking about it. It somehow relegates every other part of the experience to a lesser position than the content. And it's really not. But it's vital. And we need a more effective, more inclusive way of looking at content so that we can get others to start thinking of content more deeply along with ourselves so that we can get better content. We create better experiences. The new way that I've been approaching content and the way I advocate and evangelize for a more content out approach here at Citrix is I've changed the story a little bit. And I think of content as being core to the experience. If you just think of this drink on the side there, really, what is the experience without the content? The first time I heard this was a few years back. I saw a doodle on a napkin by Nick Fink that he called the Mai Tai diagram. And as soon as you see this diagram and you realize, wow, you take the drink out of the glass and suddenly your experience falls apart, it really starts to put into perspective how everything needs to work together, that you can't build an experience without the content, and that the content itself can shape the experience. One of the things that I really like doing is I like going back to the origin of words and being a lot more precise, understanding what they mean, and so I get a better, I can wrap my head better around these concepts. And so when I looked at these definitions, and these are right off my Mac, there's nothing special about these. We usually stop our definition of content with really what that first bullet point is, that they're things held within inside something else. We think of the contents of a package, the contents of a web page, and this is why we feel like we can design a web page with lorem ipsum and everything is going to go smooth. But again, once the content shows up, we realize, no, not so smooth after all. But if you look at that first bullet point, there's a little clue in there about the way we really need to start thinking about content, and it's this idea of substance. And it's repeated again in that second definition down there, the substance or material dealt with in a speech. And this is where we can start looking at content for its qualities, not just how much of it do we have, not just volume, not just where will it live on a page, or do we present it as a list, or do we present it as a paragraph kind of thing, but really digging in, because at the end of the day, it's the substance of our content, this meaning. That's what's going to leave the most lasting impression in the end user's mind about what they think of the overall experience. And I mentioned that this isn't just about text. If you think about Disney World, for instance, the content of Disney World are the attractions and the restaurants and things like that. So when you start to expand it, and what are the meanings of those things? Well, if the ride was meant to thrill, well, then the substance of that content needs to be thrilling. And so we can start to expand what we consider to be content way beyond simple text on a page or photographs. But for the purposes of this talk, I am going to focus mostly on content from the perspective of designing web-based experiences. But once we sort of wrapped our head around those definitions, it leaves us with this great question we can ask ourselves, and we can use this almost as a way to start measuring. We can start to build testing scenarios around this idea of, our customers I'm sorry, I actually jumped ahead too fast. I didn't look at that last definition there. This idea of a simple change in pronunciation it becomes content, that feeling of satisfaction or peacefulness. And when we think of it in that way, if we think about satisfaction, not about satisfying the bare minimum, but true satisfaction, it gives us some broad strokes with which to paint that definition. Again, if we think of Disney World, to be satisfied, well, you have to get excited. You have to be thrilled by the rides and all the attractions and stuff. But if you're doing your taxes, a good sense of satisfaction comes from the feeling that the system is going to get my tax return right, I'm not going to have the IRS coming after me because there were flaws. So we can adjust how we define satisfaction, but satisfaction is this great base to start from. And it also brings us back to designing for emotion. It keeps the notion that an end user's emotional state is what's at stake here. And so that gives us this great question of, will users be content with the content of our contents? You know, dissatisfied with the substance of the stuff that we give them, because that's what they're looking for. People come in, they have something in their mind that they want to get resolved, and they need help with that. And it's really about the substance, and that's what I want to focus on a lot with this particular talk. So at the end of the day, when we start to look at these things, a content-led, our UX-led content strategy really accounts for all three of these key aspects, not just what do we have, what format is it in, things like that, where is it going to live in the information architecture, but again, how satisfied will people be with it? And that we can find out, we can test for by looking at the substance of the content itself. Because at the end of the day, all of the content on a page is really UX content, and to some extent even UI content, as you'll see later on. And I like this quote from Joel Marsh, UX content gets shit done in this directly and simply as possible. And that's really what our end users are trying to achieve. They come in with a mission in mind, something they're trying to accomplish. And when we don't dig into the content, we can give them this brilliant, intuitive user interface that they can slide right through and get to content. But then at the end of that line, that content just doesn't fulfill their need. And that's what we're trying to get to. And that's why we need to take on a more involved role. But there's an upside to this, because I know that it sounds like I'm giving us all additional work over and above the work we've already got. But the benefit from our perspective come in two major ways. One is we will see an increase in productivity. If we can get people to iron out the content before they start asking us to wireframe pages for the web, for instance, we're going to go through many less iterations on that. And I can tell you this from experience. The other thing, too, is once people start to realize that as we're trying to apply our UX methodology to content, to find that substance within the content on top of figuring out how to get people through to the content, we start to buy ourselves a place at the decision-making table. You'll start to get less of those situations where people come over and say, hey, make me a wireframe and I'll figure out what to put into that wireframe later. We start to be included in those initial conversations where it's like, well, what should we tell our end user? And this is a great benefit to UX, and it elevates us from being a tactical support player within an organization to a more strategic partner in the grand scheme of things, and that is a huge benefit for UX. So let's start looking at some of the things that we need to do in order to get there, some tools that we use, and just, again, still continue to reshape and get our heads wrapped around how we should be thinking about content, because we really need a few things. We need to change our mindset, which we talked about, what content is not, and a better way to think about content not being king but being core. But also we need to think about how does it influence design, and we also need to know that there are some tools that can help us in this process. So if we're working from the content out, the very first thing is to go back to basics and understand that content informs design. It's really not the other way around. Now, there is a relationship between these two, and sure, you may think of one thing, start designing it, and it gives you a whole new idea, and you go back and you can update the content. So it's not 100% linear or dictatorship from the content perspective. There does have to be that give and take at times, but starting from the content is where we need to. It's because the content is why people came. Again, thinking of that drink, people came for a beverage. They didn't come for an empty glass when they walk into a bar. And when we think about the idea that content drives design, nobody ever designed one of these glasses and then tried to figure out what drink they put into it. They had a beverage in mind. The design of the glass has been made to enhance the experience of the content, not the other way around. If we think about that wine glass in the middle, for instance, the long stem, and that allows you to hold the glass in a way that the palm of your hand doesn't warm the wine and change the substance of it, the flavor. The way it tapers at the top does two things. It traps in some of the aroma so that you can assess what the wine people would refer to as the nose of the wine. It allows you to swirl it around the glass without it spilling over onto you, so you can assess what they would call the foot of the wine. You try swirling a martini, you're going to wear it because that glass is not designed for swirling. So content is always, working from the content out always helps when it comes to the design process. It reduces the amount of iterations we'll go through. It reduces debate over, well, is this best in this form or best in that form? It really can change the conversation. And it's a lot faster and easier to change content when it's still inside of Microsoft Word, where people are writing things or thinking about it. It's so much faster and easier to make the changes then. The expense of actually making those changes is less because it's quicker. So there's so many benefits to working from the content out. And when we don't, that's when we end up with these kind of experiences that are like this. We get these Swiss Army experiences. We don't get a real, or worse yet, we end up with something like this where we have no idea what our user really wants, so we throw everything in there. When we go and we back up and we're trying to really design the right experience, what our end users are looking for, and what's much easier for us to design, is something like this. A very precise tool for accomplishing a goal. And it's a lot easier to design a single blade with a single handle than it is to design that big, massive, all-inclusive Swiss Army knife. And it's also much better for the end user. We need some tools that will help us achieve that. One of the things that we need to do too, though, is we need to have a step down from that idea that content is core. We need a more tactical way now too to think of content. And what I promote around here is this idea of being thoughtfully ruthless. This isn't the same as saying, oh, we need to minimize content or we need to reduce content or anything like that. What we're really trying to do is we need to weed out what is unnecessary, and we need to be very thoughtful not to inadvertently weed out what is useful. So to do that, what we're trying to achieve is what I call this idea of appropriately precise content. It's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. And when we use these words appropriate, and we think, is this right for the situation? Again, this influences how we will talk about the content, what belongs in the experience, and what doesn't. And the idea of being precise is where we end up with just the right amount of words. We're not just cutting or we're not just adding. We're being thoughtful. It's like, does that one word really tell the story I needed to tell? Is it evoke the right response that I needed to evoke? And again, this is how we get to, and this is where we really get to that substance of the content, is when we think about being appropriately precise. So I'm going to use a case study from Citrix here to illustrate some of the tools we use and some of the results that we got by following this content out methodology. So when I first started here a few years back, the very first project I was put on was redesigning our corporate intranet. And I came in, part of why they actually hired me was I had this crazy idea of if we work from the content out, we get a much better result. And so I came in with a set of ideas of tools and processes that we were going to use to do this. But we started, as good UX people do, we started with our research. We went and we talked to our employees to find out what things were bothering them, where they found challenges and stuff like that. And these three on the left here were some of the really big ones that they were running into. It was taking too long to find what they wanted. They weren't finding the right stuff when they did find stuff. And really, they just needed to get back to work because let's face it, their bosses, they're not going to be happy if they miss a deadline on a project because they were too busy in the internet trying to find support to get their laptop back up and running or something like that. So we really need to think about this. We needed to find a better way to do that. So one of the first tools that I introduced here was a page table. And this comes straight out of Christina Halverson's book of Content Strategy for the Web. And this may be probably, from my perspective, this is maybe the single most effective tool for getting people to focus on the right content, the substance of the content for a page. Now again, this is designed to be for web pages, but if you're creative with this, I think you can still use this in ways to define other experiences. If we take a closer look at this, there's really two parts to every page table. The first one is this thing called the priority index. The other part is the page outline, and that's where you start to flesh out the details of the content that will go on a page. But what I always push for is to always spend as much time as you need to on this priority index and get this right. This is where all the arguing will happen, but I can assure you that, again, based on experience, if you spend most of your time here, by the time you start filling out that page outline, there will be a lot less discussion around that, a lot less concern or disconnect or misalignment on that, and that will trickle down into doing your wireframes and doing your mock-ups. You will see fewer iterations on those because you will be more aligned internally. Now, that's not to say that once you get this whole thing out into the world and you test it with users, you might have to still change everything. You're not going to get away from that, but at least internally, it can prevent you from getting stuck in these endless loops of debate. So there's two places that I really say focus the majority of your time on. The first one is the objective, and the second one is priority one. I'm going to talk about both of them right now. So for the objective, one of the things that I also introduced here was something I came up with called emotion-driven goals. And basically they break down into three simple parts. The first part is, what would we like our end user to feel? The second part of it is, well, what can we do to hopefully make them feel that way? And then we sandwich it on the other side with, well, what are they trying to achieve? And it's important to think of them this way and take them in this order too, because we can absolutely measure and try to test and find out if we're even remotely on target with the emotion we're trying to get people to feel. We can ask a question like, how much do you agree with the following statement? So in this case, you'll see how this was used, and I'll explain how this was used in just a moment with regards to our Backstage project. We wanted people to feel confident, so it was easy enough to put together a question that said, hey, how much do you agree with the following statement? I'm extremely confident I understand what my health benefits are based on the content of this page. You give them a scale. I don't agree with it at all. I agree with it wholeheartedly, kind of a thing. And you can gauge these things, get a sense of where you're at, if you're on target or off target. And then defining what you want to do. And then what makes these emotion-driven goals so much better than what people will normally put into an objective, something like, we want employees to spend more time on site, or we want to do this, or we want to do that. And they're these really vague, and they're really business-centric goals that often make their way into that objective. This turns it around. This makes it more user-centric. And so when we close out, okay, here's what we need to do now that we're thinking of the end user. In this case, the intranet was owned by our internal communications team, and there's a lot of other stakeholders involved. So that home page, and I'll back up real quick so you can see it. You can see this was kind of a crazy mess here. There was, like, if I'm remembering right, something like 87 links on this page when people first landed here. So when we talked about removing the noise and downplaying distractions, that had a big role in what that was. And referring to it as reducing noise rather than cut content forced us to think about in terms, again, of substance. Really, what is noise and what is important signal that we want people to pay attention to? What's a real distraction and what's really adding value? So again, just wording these differently, being a little more specific and, again, more precise in what we're trying to do. And really the end goal for the employees was, I need to get back to work because I can't spend all day in here. So where we ended up after before I move on to that, let's talk about the next thing. So this is for the objective. This is probably the one part, getting to that priority one, that may be the most contentious part of filling out a page table. I suspect that many of you have experienced the same thing that I have, where when you ask, well, what's the most important thing on this page, you hear it's all important. With a page table, you get into some great debate, and hopefully you're working in environments where they encourage that. I'm lucky here at Citrix that they do, about no, we can only have one of these. And if you don't get in the pop reference culture for that background image, it's from one of my favorite movies, Highlander. But again, this is where we really had to learn to be thoughtfully ruthless and really argue over why one thing had to take precedence over another, because this really would inform the page architecture. You know, what content was coming first, because inevitably somebody will bring up the fold when you're talking about a web page, which is a whole other crazy topic that I won't get into now. But this really forces conversation, and it's good to have these conversations, because if we're really thinking of the end user, these conversations need to happen. But there was one more piece to the puzzle too that we needed to think about. So we had done our research, we had our user personas, but we needed something else. Again, if we're getting to the substance of things, it's not just a matter of what you say, but it's also how you say it. Our parents have probably all told us this. Our mentors have probably all told us the same thing. You can tell someone something, but if you don't deliver it correctly, they'll never hear you. So what we did was we backed up again and we thought, well, how can we find out and make sure that we're speaking in a way that our end users will hear us, not just throwing out what we want them to hear. And one of the ways we did that was we leveraged from Aaron Walter's book here, Designing for Emotion, this idea of a design persona. So we created this design persona called Claire for Backstage, and we talked about all her personality traits. And I'm sorry, I'll go fast as you don't need to read every word on here. What were her personality traits? What was her voice like? How did she dress? And you treat it like it's a person. When somebody is having a problem, how would Claire respond to a problem versus Claire's just introducing herself to somebody? How would she introduce herself versus how would she handle somebody who needs support? And when you talk through these things, then you start to find the right way to deliver the substance of your message in a way that people will hear. And what we ended up with after all that was a different approach to this. And this was done in a true collaborative spirit with the internal communications team. We got them to move away from having all those distractions on there. We got a lot of really wonderful and results from these things that we had planned for. But probably the one that's most striking from our perspective was the fact that within those first four main categories, the inside Citrix and benefits and pay and career learning and travel and expense, amongst those, we reduced the content within each of those categories anywhere from 60 to 90%. And when you think that this was a team whose whole job was to create content, we were able to get them to strip it away, to get to a more, to have less noise and more signal in the experience. That was a real feat, but it was a great feeling when everybody was done. Nobody felt like they had lost anything. It was because we were all aligned, because we had gone through those page tables, and we did a page table for every single page within those four categories. In some cases, if you have a group of pages, say like a product detail page on an e-commerce site, you may be able to create a single page table that really just outlines the order in which your content's coming from, or the priority of it. Maybe it's about promoting a discount is always a priority depending on your site, or promoting benefits is always the #1 priority. You can potentially have a page table for a set of similar pages like that. But we got all the metrics we were hoping for. We needed to increase use of search. We thought that was going to be the more effective way to get people the right things. We got all of the metrics that we were looking for. And on top of that, now unlike Backstage or Citrix.com, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we didn't measure, or we didn't have NPS in place at the time, but through anecdotal responses from everybody, there was a massive improvement in employee satisfaction along with these other technical benefits that we saw. We had a similar issue within the support section of our intranet as well, and so we took the same approach. And like I mentioned before, and I'll show you in a second, we didn't actually have to update our emotion-driven goal. We were actually able to use essentially that same goal to rethink this whole page, because we had even more problems on this page. This was a very drill down hierarchical thing, and it was designed by the support team, and it reflected the structure, which the way they stored their documents on their side. They just up-leveled their document structure, which no end user thinks that way. So they thought they were really thoughtful in how they were trying to do this, but again, they didn't have the end user in mind. So we came back and looked at it again because it was really creating two major problems. People were giving up, they were getting worn out, and they stopped using search because search didn't give them the right results, or they bailed out and they called our support centers. And that was a big one, was they were getting a higher than expected volume of calls to the support center for very common tasks that they knew they had content already on that support site for. That also caused a lot of people to be pogo sticking up and down through the experience because they would drill down, find out they were in the wrong place, and they'd have to come back to the surface and drill back down into another one. But all of this was really working against them. But again, motion-driven goal for the page, talked about the priorities and all that stuff, and ended up with this. Again, we got the results we were looking for, even better than what was expected. We saw near 50% increase in people opening up those online tickets instead of calling in to the call center, which costs us more money. So they saw a big savings in cost because of these changes. But it all came back to, again, understanding the substance of the content and what people were trying to do, using those emotion-driven goals, using that design persona to frame things and change the way that we were conversing with employees. And all of this UX was there through all of the content creation. I personally reviewed every single one of the page tables before they ever wrote any content for the pages, and we got content for every page even before we did the wireframes for any pages. So it allowed us to really shape this while it was still easy to shape, versus down the road after you've designed something, people get married to those designs and suddenly you start to figure out, how can I shoehorn content into the design because I love the visual. So we came at this from a very different approach. When we first started the project and we were having trouble getting adoption for page tables, wireframes were taking us 6, 7, 8 rounds of revisions. By the time we got the page table thing really flowing and everybody had done a few and they got bought in on the idea, they got excited about it. They wouldn't even come to us until they had a page table written out and reviewed by us. Those wires were going through more like an average of 2 to 3 rounds of revisions, not 7, 8 type. So it really helped us be much more productive. And UX, at one point I was becoming a roadblock because it would take me so long to keep revising these wires that I was holding up the flow as the only UX person on there. So this allowed me to be much more efficient in getting the job done. And the other thing that I started to look at too is we need to start thinking about content. Again, and at the moment I'm really referring to the text or the visuals of the content, so I am coming back more to design. Content is functional. It's all about function, but part of what we need to do, we need to change our way of thinking on this to make sure that we get what I mean by functional is we have to reevaluate how we think of functionality. Usually we only think about how we interact with a website through some sort of a touch device. We'll use one of these. This is how we interact with a site. But there's a step that happens long before that. Before the hands ever get engaged, we experience the site, every experience, through our eyes, our ears, our sense of smell. There's all these other ways that we interact long before our hands ever get involved. And usually this is a more interactive. I do this presentation in public, so I can't tell, but I'm going to guess that a whole lot of you are stuck staring at those big baby blue eyes and haven't really read the substance off to the left there. So let me change this a little bit. And when we start to understand that everything that we put on there is an interactive element, not just something that's clickable, but anything we see has the ability to force a person's eyes to move around the page, we've got to be really aware of what we're putting on every page and how we're directing them, because this is a form of interaction, so we need to expand that a little bit. And I bring that up too because, so now I'll start talking a little bit about Citrix.com, or yeah, Citrix.com, our main website, and some of the places where when we start to think about UX traditionally, we often stop ourselves with thinking of the UI, or maybe just, is it going to be, am I going to have a video or am I going to have text? But again, we don't often dig down into what is the substance of all this. And when you consider the amount of real estate that the content takes up on a page and the fact that it needs to be functional, we've got to start moving beyond testing things like our navigation, testing button colors and things like that. We've got to continue to dig a little bit deeper because content is part of the UI and we can actually test it similar to the UI. So here's a quick pop quiz. Just in the chat, just throw in the number of the thing of content that you think is easiest to read. And I'll just take a minute and let people just go ahead and throw that in there. Essentially, the content in all three columns is identical. But in order to surface the substance of that content, there's always going to be something that works better than others. And so again, digging deeper, and this is why we've got to go out of our way to read the content that's going on the page, to really find the best way to make the substance of the content more visible to people. If you've read anything online about web experiences, everyone will tell you that people don't read word for word on a page. They scan. And so we need to make sure that we're providing content in a way that makes that happen. And this might, I'm hoping this is somewhat repetitive for some of you, that you're thinking this way already, but when the people who come to you with content, they're really not thinking this way. And so it's on us again to try to help them, help shape their ideas of how we might present content and not be pigeonholed into whatever one way they might think is true. Test it, find out what's working best. Because at the end of the day, UX content needs to satisfy real needs. So when we were doing, again, when we're looking at this now on Citrix.com, we were looking at this more from that satisfaction perspective. It wasn't just about the content, but we had a lot of ideas again of things that we thought might be causing problems. One of the things that we were concerned with was, as you read this, I don't know if anybody's trying to read that little eye chart in the screen grab there. That is from one of our pages, or was at one point. You're probably finding that fairly difficult to read. And we had the theory that this difficulty in reading was probably something that was adversely affecting satisfaction. That in order for us to have people more satisfied and want to engage and drive more deeply into the section, readability was something else that we were going to have to contend with. So again, if we hadn't read these pages, and saw that they were hard to read, or even just felt that they were hard to read, this would have just made its way into the design. In fact, it did, and we've gone back since and we've changed this. But we needed a way to measure this. So another tool that we were using was, went out and I did a search, found there was this tool that lets you measure the readability of something. So I copied and pasted over the content. Now, this particular content actually was not that difficult to read. It had a fairly decent score from a readability perspective, and I'll explain that in here in just a second. But this was one of the things, again, going back to the substance. If people don't understand the words, they can't understand the substance of what you're trying to say. And so we used this tool then. We started to measure all the content that was going on the page. I'd get a Word doc in, cut and paste all that text, drop it onto this tool, get an assessment, make recommendations back to the team. Hey, if we change this, this, and this, we can improve this. It becomes a little more clear, a little more obvious to read. So what makes for easy to read content is the big question there. So did a bunch of research on this and found that for most websites, an average grade, and by grade level they are referring to U.S. school grades, from kindergarten to high school. or beyond, colleges and whatnot, you know, somewhere around 8 is a good average reading score for most things. But if you're like us, we've got a lot of technical details, we don't have the choice, we don't have that option to get it down to an 8th grade reading level. In fact, most people might even find that condescending if we got it there. That's to the point where we're dumbing things down, and we didn't want to go there. But we needed to be appropriately precise, so we had to adjust where we wanted to be. But on average, this is what is recommended for most sites. Blogs, if you're writing for a general blog kind of a thing. But again, adjust as necessary for your audience. In general, a lower reading score means that you're using vocabulary at a certain reading level. Doesn't talk about the structure. That's where that reading ease score comes in. Two of the things that we always had problems with, we used too many. We had enough big words that we had to use, but then we compounded it by adding in additional big words, and that's what drove down a lot of our reading, or drove up our grade level on many things. The reading ease actually will refer more to the structure of the sentence. Do you have a lot of run-on sentences? Are you using grammar poorly and things like that? It's really more about the quality of the sentence and things like that. And we had a tendency to do a lot of run-on sentences. The example I showed you earlier where I asked you to vote, when you read through that, what you essentially take away is there's a laundry list of features in there, but it's buried in a paragraph. It was hard to see, and that makes it hard to read. Just the simple change of moving that into a bulleted list increased the readability, it increased the scannability, it just made it so much easier to do. So, we started looking for opportunities to do that. But I also wanted to try to benchmark this against other things. I was trying to think to myself, what would somebody consider to be a difficult book to read, and probably would never read it because there's just something about it. And War and Peace came to my mind. I've never read it because I've always thought I don't have 3 months to read a book. But I also assumed that the reading level on it was going to be difficult. And it's really not. It falls right in line with that. It's got a great readability score. It's got a great grade average. It's technically a very easy book to read. So really, I think I was just put off by the volume of this thing. But I wanted to use something as a comparison. When we started to look at Backstage, or rather Citrix.com, how would we grade ourselves? Now, when we did this, I started to evaluate the current content. You can see we had some pretty rough grades there. Average grade of 12, which 12 plus, which is kind of high. Not bad. Or I'm sorry, jumped ahead. Or I'm sorry, an average score of 20 for the grade, which means we were using a lot of big words, and an average readability all the way down there at 12. This is terrible. Now, we did a lot of rework on that. We were able to get that grade down considerably, and we were able to get that readability up even more. And again, like I said, we have a very technical product that we sell. We can't get away from using a word like infrastructure, for instance. That's just what it is. There is no shorter version of the word infrastructure that communicates as clearly as that word does. So again, this goes back to the idea of substance and being precise and appropriate. Now, we didn't have the opportunity to apply this method to every single one of the product areas when we did this redesign. We had one team, though, that did, and so through the networking section, we really took the same approach that I took on Backstage. We sat with them. We developed page tables for every single one of the pages that were on there, and we worked our way through that. And when we were all said and done with that, that one section, the networking section alone, was the only section after redesign that saw an improvement in NPS, and that's a user satisfaction score, and a pretty major one at that. This is what delivering the right substance in that appropriately precise way and working from the content out can achieve. It can get you these types of results, not incremental A/B testing that sometimes will happen. We have an idea, we'll try it, let's change the button colors, let's go from blue to red and see what happens. You get these little incremental changes, but everywhere we've run this approach, we have seen high double, triple digit increases in the key metrics that we were trying to achieve. And at the end of it all, really, UX content this is stuff that doesn't just fill space on a screen, it fulfills human needs. And that comes again from the substance of it. We really need to think this way and really get our heads wrapped around that we're not shaping content to fit our designs, but we're shaping the design to enhance the content, to deliver that perfect, that right content, the precise, the substantive content in a way that really meets end user needs. And coming back to all the way to the beginning, just shifting our mindset from content is king to content is core is a big step in the right direction. Getting ourselves into this mindset where we're taking the opportunity, we're taking the time to do this. Again, it's not just for our end users, it's not just for business. It helps our industry as a whole by focusing on content in this way, because again, it gives us the opportunity to showcase ourselves as being strategic thinkers, as getting out of being relegated to just doing wireframes and getting into those conversations early, so we don't have to be the roadblock or the no person saying, yeah, but that's not what end users want, and having that happen so far down the road. So content is core. If that's the one thing that you take away from the whole talk, I will be a happy, happy camper. Thank you.
This is awesome, Mike. Thanks so much. This is great content, and thanks for sharing with us. We have a few questions for you. So I'm gonna start with what do you do when lots of different organizations are the owners of the content? And the example is intranets.
So that was a particular challenge that we struggled with early on. I got very lucky. So when we did the intranet, we started off with the main stakeholder. We got them on board first. And the main stakeholder for the entirety of the intranet and the owner of the entirety of the intranet was the internal communications team. We started there. We were able to get, and once we got the bugs worked out with that group and they started to see the value of it, as we had on board, so we took it one section at a time, and we started with all of the sections that were under the internal communication team's control. Then we moved on to the HR section, and we onboarded the HR team in a similar way, only now with less bugs in our onboarding process. We actually put together a package. So when we start working with the HR team, what we did was we said, okay, here's our onboarding kit. We're going to sit with you for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it takes. We're going to walk you through how we're going to develop content here. So we're going to have you fill out a page table, but we'll work with you at first. We'll co-create this page table with you. And then we will, once you get the swing of it, we can let you run and we'll just review them afterwards. And so that was a great thing. And we did that with every single team that we onboarded. And again, the good thing was, the senior VP of internal communications really began to love this process because she started to see how it was changing the intranet and how much less swirl we had in doing this stuff, that she became an advocate. So if we did actually run into a problem stakeholder, we could say, go talk to her. She'll tell you why we're doing it this way, and we'll do it that way. And so there were a couple of people, but for the most part, once we got them into it, and we didn't just hand them the page table and say, fill this out. We taught them how to do it. And that really helped make the onboarding of new stakeholders easier. And because we were there, as UX was involved at every stage, we then had visibility to what those other teams were doing it. So when one team would try to do something that might conflict with something another team was going to do, we were able to provide insight, and we'd say, all right, we'd either work it out ourselves with them, or we'd say, okay, we need to get the two of you into a room because you've got some competing agendas here that we need to get fixed. And again, it put us into a strategic role rather than just an execution role, and that made a big, big difference.
Thank you. And I have another question for you about how do you use to get the appropriate, precise content? Any research methods in particular that you have used?
So I didn't cover research methods here because I think a lot of it is the stuff that we all, I'm hoping, are doing anyway. So we did our user interviews in advance. We built out user personas. We built out a design persona for both our intranet and our external site. We use those to allow us to shape the conversation between the two sets of personas. And then, going back, we used the readability tool to make sure we weren't using unnecessary big words through things. And when it comes to the substance part of it, actually, that's probably the hardest thing, because you can get to very functional content relatively easy if you use the similar methodologies to how we would consider whether or not a user interface is functional. But getting to the substance of it, that still requires going back then afterwards and putting some people, in some cases you have to put them into uh, a non-realistic environment. You sometimes actually have to ask people, please read all this content for me, which is not what most people do, but once you get them to read them, if they are the right target audience, they can give you great feedback. You know what? I read that. That is not what we need at all. Or that's exactly what it is, but we call it this. So we were able to get some of the folksonomy, if you will, the end user's words, and we were able to replace some of our words with their words, and that helped make things more clear on that. The precision, it is a sliding scale. There's no one definitive answer there. Typical UX response, I know. It depends. But you have to know the end user and be able to align that with business goals too. Just because the end user doesn't want to hear about some limitation that maybe you have on something doesn't mean you should throw that out. You have to find a way to tell that story again, and that's where those two sets of personas really helped out. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thanks. And how did you get other teams to buy into this process to understand the importance of UX in content development?
Again, that is the ongoing battle. Every time we onboard a new team, so like I said, I'm working on Citrix.com now, and every time we engage, so as we're going through the different product sections, we have to engage a new product team. So we have to onboard them each and every time. So it's sort of a never-ending learning cycle, but at this point, I know that if I go back to the internal communications team, I'm not going to have a problem with them. They're going to, or I'm not going to get pushback from them on the process. They are now fully bought in. They don't even come to us without having page tables in advance. And then as we get that, and there are always going to be holdouts. There are people who are set in their ways, and this is the way we've always done it. This is the way we're going to do it. And sometimes it just takes planting a seed and allowing it time to grow in their minds until it becomes kind of their idea. It's like, you know what? I think I should work from the content out. It's like, great, glad you figured that out. And sometimes you just have to leave it with them and let them find their own path back to it. But a lot of times, once you start to show the value, so when I introduce this to some other teams, I will share, here's how this helped us. And once they see that and they understand it, or if they've used Backstage, for instance, and they realize, oh, Backstage worked out is so much better than it used to be, sometimes those are easy ones. Oh, that's how you got there. Okay, let's try that way. But there are always times where the status quo is hard to change, and you've got to be persistent. But again, as you deliver your message to them, you have to find that right way. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment, find out, well, what's holding them up? What's making them feel like this isn't doable, or this isn't going to be easy to do, or something like that? And you really do have to, this is where you have to use your own emotional intelligence to resolve that challenge.
Thanks. So we have the time for a couple of more questions, and we are getting questions also about slides and recording, and a lot of people thanking you. So yes, we are going to share the recordings and the slides in a week or so. The slides will be in SlideShare, and you will all get an email with the link for the slides and the recordings. So we appreciate it. The questions. So the next one is, what tools did you use to determine the reading level of your content?
There in the slide, there's a link to it, but I believe hang on, let me back up and see if I think they changed the URL on this, but it was called readabilityscore.com at one point. I think it's now readability.io is what it changed to. That was one. There's more than one. If you actually just Google readability test, you should find this. It should be one of the first ones that comes up. But this was the actual one that we used. And I think even Microsoft Word, it's a little buried in the program, but Microsoft Word actually has a reading tool. Another one that I use when I'm writing my own content, it's available on Macs and PCs as well as on the web. It's called Hemingway app. Hemingway app does a nice job of giving you guidance where you're using passive voice or where you have run-on sentences or individual sentence within there. So what these programs do is they'll highlight where your problems are. They don't just say, hey, this whole thing has got a score of 20. They'll highlight in red, this one sentence is difficult to read, or this one is a little hard to read, and they'll give you some ideas of where to break things down, and they'll point out some grammatical errors or style choices that you might want to make a decision on.
Great. So last question here. You said that you applied the same design changes to all categories and product pages. Wasn't there the possibility that different types of users use different categories or pages, and that based on their needs, design might need to be different?
Categories on citrix.com, is that what they were asking?
Not sure.
I'll make the assumption that that's what they were talking about, and I'll share the insight there. So visually, they all got the same exact treatment. What was interesting was that we were also trying to figure out, would design alone increase user satisfaction? So for 3 out of those 4 categories, content got migrated over as is with no change in content whatsoever, but every page got the same exact design upgrades. Only the section that we completely rewrote the content and took this approach to saw the uptick in usability or in satisfaction. You know, it's so yeah, in a way, yes, but when we consider that, so I'm rereading the question, sorry. Yes, to your point, it potentially could have, but since there was a direct migration of content, that did not change, and our audience didn't change. I don't believe that would have had any effect on the satisfaction score.
Great, thanks again, Mike. I'm just going to share one comment that we got here. It just represents, so many other comments of people excited about your presentation today. So Analia says this was extremely helpful. The page table is something I think would make a difference on our internal sales. And she is interested in the slides and recordings. As I said, they will be available to everyone. Thank you again, Mike. This was great. And thanks, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed the webinar today. Hope to see you next time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Jana. I appreciate everything you've done. And thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm glad you found the time to join us.